Hey guys, Chewy the Brick here. So I'm coming at you now with part 2 of the Ford 396 FE assembly. So to start this portion, I'm going to go ahead and start by assembling my piston and rod assemblies. So I went with some Hastings 30 over basic cast rings, nothing super fancy here. So I got those guys, and I have the factory Ford 390 rods that I had reconditioned at the machine shop, along with new wrist pin bushings installed and some ARP rod bolts, along with some Speed Pro 30 over forged pistons for the build. So that is everything for the piston assemblies that we're going to need. So we're going to go ahead and get started on that. So for the 390 rod assemblies here, like I said, I'm using the original factory Ford rods that were reconditioned and 30 over pistons. So first thing I'm going to go ahead and do is knock out this wrist pin in here of the piston. And a note is that on the FE connecting rods, don't know how well you guys will be able to see this, but on this side obviously there's a casting dot here, and what this casting dot is to indicate which side of the crank this needs to face. So this needs to face the counterweight sides, because there's a large bevel inside the rod here. And on the opposite side there's a smaller chamfer, which is where your other connecting rod would sit face to face on here. So this is the side that faces the crank, this is the side that faces another rod. Also to note, these have an oiling hole in the top of them that goes through the wrist pin bushing in there, and what you need to do is face this upward in the piston. So as your piston is going up and down the cylinder, this is squirting the top of the piston so that it oils the cylinder. As another side note, factory pistons include this, but some aftermarket ones typically do. As you guys can see this arrow, you want this arrow facing towards the front of your engine. So, with all that information in mind, I'm going to go ahead and start assembling these. So I'm going to go ahead and assemble these for the passenger side bank, if I'm remembering that correctly. So, I'm going to go ahead and get my royal purple. Take that guy, get a little bit of lube in here inside the wrist pin bushing. Go ahead and spread that around so you got a nice coat inside there. Whatever, all this be nice and lubricated for your first fire up. And what I'm going to go ahead and do also is turn the piston over here. And lubricate where the wrist pin rides inside the piston here. Same thing, just a nice even coat of lube in here. Just like so. Now I'm going to make sure my orientation on this is correct. So if this is going to be the frontmost cylinder, I'm going to want my dotted side of the rod facing the front of the block, just like so, with the oil squirter upward, which means the arrow of my piston needs to face forward, which is the correct orientation right now. So I'm going to go ahead, lubricate the wrist pin real quick. And I am going to go ahead and insert this into the piston and through the rod. And just double checking myself, the dot is facing forward, which means I need to install it this way. Just like so. Alright, so with the piston on the wrist pin all lubricated up, that's all ready to go now. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is install the circlips so that the wrist pin does not come out of the piston. Now, I'm just using a factory style circlip. These are what was included with the Speed Pro pistons here. And so on these circlips there is a rounded side, and if you roll it over there's a sharp side here. Kind of a more of a squared off edge on this. And that is the edge that you want to face outward in the locking slot in the piston. That way you don't run the risk of it coming out. So I have a pair of channel lock snap ring pliers. I'm going to go ahead and close this guy up. And the way I like to do is I like to put the circlip ears facing downward. So I'm going to go ahead and close this up. Make sure I'm in the groove, which I overshot it a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that back out just a touch. Right there. Still not quite, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a pick and just kind of get that final lock. There we go. So you heard that audible click, which means if I bring this up here now, you guys can see that's sitting in the groove and it's not going anywhere. So go ahead and roll it over, push that wrist pin in the rest of the way into the piston, repeat the process. Find your sharp edge, your round edge. You want your round edge towards the wrist pin, your sharp edge on the outside of the piston. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my snap ring pliers again. Close the circlip. Just like that. So, now we have a completed piston put together. All we're missing now is the piston rings. So let me go ahead and get these all out. I will bring you guys back. So for our piston ring install here on the 396 piston, what I'm going to go ahead and do is start with the oiling rings, and they're at the bottom of the piston, a little bit easier to access right now. Don't have to worry about catching the compression rings. So what I'm going to do is put the scraper ring on first into the bottommost groove here. Just kind of roll it around on the piston onto itself, just like so. Now that's in its groove. And what I'm going to do next is take the two portions of the oil ring here, lay one underneath the scraper, just like so, and same thing, just kind of let it walk itself around, and it'll position itself underneath there just the way I want it to. Okay, just like that. Then I'm going to take the next one here. Now, there's no particular rule on this, it's just kind of my thing that I like to do. So the gap on this first oil ring is on this side of the piston. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this guy 180 degrees and put the next opening on this side. I don't think you have to do this, but this is just kind of a practice I have. I set all the ring gaps 90 degrees off of each other. That way it has no possibility of blow by. So I'm going to rock that into there. And just like that, your oil rings are installed. Now, onto the second compression ring. According to the Hastings instructions, the instructions say to install on this diagram with the ring with the dot up. So I'm going to install that ring with the dot up, and what I'm going to do is take my pair of piston ring pliers and I'm going to set this ring gap in line with this side of the wrist pin. So I'm going to spread that open. A little difficult sometimes with hands occupied. Not going in the way I wanted it to. Well, let's try and do the old method. Well, I'll give these a try again. You don't want to overexpand your rings because you can run the risk of breaking them. Which is the only thing I am worried about at this point. Just like so. Alright, so we got the second compression ring into its groove there. Just like so. So what I'm going to do now is rotate the piston over 180 degrees. Now the upper compression ring, according to the instructions, since there is no upper mark on these, there's no particular orientation for here. So same thing, I'm going to grab my ring pliers, open up the upper piston ring, and put it over just like so. Rock that into its slot, and just like that, my first and second compression rings are installed onto my piston along with my oil rings. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to make 8 rods and pistons, or excuse me, 4 rods and pistons similar with this one. So this is included in that count of 4. And then make 4 facing the opposite direction, so that way I have a passenger bank and a driver bank set of rods and pistons. So I'm going to go ahead and get those all assembled, and then we'll get these into the block. So for the next step for the piston installation, we went ahead and put together our piston assemblies. So now we're going to install the pistons into the block. First thing I'm going to have to do though, is I'm going to install the brand new Speed Pro 20 under rod bearings. So I'm going to go ahead and install those into the first rod and piston, get the piston into the ring compressor, and get you guys set up on the cylinder, tap that first piston in. Okay, so with the piston assemblies all together, piston rings installed, what I'm going to go ahead and do is put a real thin coat of engine oil inside the cylinders here. And this is just to help lubricate the cylinders for tapping in the pistons and whatnot. This is nothing fancy. I'm just using some Shell Rotella T4. I think I picked it up at like Walmart or something. It's like $10 a gallon. So good enough to just kind of put a sheen of oil on the cylinder walls for tapping in the pistons initially. So what I went ahead and did also is, in line with that bore, I put the crankshaft journal at the top of its stroke, so that when I go to tap this guy in, it'll just basically drop right onto the crank. So I went cheap and easy. I got some fuel hose from Napa Auto Parts, just cut it in half, and I'll use that as booties to protect the ARP rod bolts on here. So I got my piston ring compressor on here. You can see down here the arrow is facing forward. So I'm going to go ahead and drop this guy into the cylinder with the rod bearing pre-lubricated. I'm going to set that down just so the skirt sets onto the bore. I'm going to go ahead and take the base of the handle of this rubber mallet. Okay, so now that the piston is in its bore, if you guys tap in your piston and the piston stops dead, stop. Completely stop what you're doing. Don't tap this A for you. You run the risk of either damaging the piston, damaging or breaking a ring, or you can even damage the block. It's possible that the ring didn't index inside the bore, so you want to stop, assess, see what made it stop, or maybe you hit the crank with your rod bolts or whatever the case may be. But just stop it, check it over, make sure you're good, then keep going. So I got that down into the bore. My arrow's facing forward. So I'm going to go ahead and tap this down gently. Actually, I think it is sitting. Oh, ha! So actually, it is sitting on the crankshaft right there. So that couldn't have been perfect. Or couldn't have been any more perfect, I say. So what I'm going to go ahead and do then, scoot you guys back slightly. I'm going to rotate the block over, And then we're going to deal with putting the rod cap onto the base of the piston here. So, I'm going to rock this back a little bit, get the pin out of the engine stand. Hope the block doesn't hit the tripod and knock you all over. Which I think we are going to be all in the clear. Fantastic. Oh, nudge you a little bit, but you all shall survive. See you guys back a little bit more there. Right, so I got the block turned over here. I'm going to go ahead and put the handle for the engine stand back away. Now you guys can see that that worked awesome. These two pieces of fuel hose, radiator, let's just let that go right in. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull those right off the piston there. And that's just a nice $1.50 way instead of having to buy Cleveite rod bolt boots. Just $1.50 on some fuel hose. A little bit more economical, a little bit easier in my opinion. So what I also did beforehand is I found on the rod, I found a side where I went in. You can see I put a Sharpie mark on there. I marked it on the corresponding side on the rod also, make it a little bit easier to reinstall. So I'm going to take my assembly lube here, lubricate this rod bearing. Nice healthy coat. Again, this is what's going to protect your engine on initial fire up, so don't get stingy on your lube. A little bit extra never hurt. I'm going to go ahead and drop that down onto rod bolts. And as I had previously stated, I am using ARP rod bolts. I'm going to go ahead and take the handle of the mallet here. Just like so. And now what I'm going to try to do, hopefully without failing, here we are, so I'm going to try and bring this piston up. That way it's a little bit easier to access these studs initially without failing like that. So I'm going to go underneath the block here on the other side and just tap the piston up slightly. Should have put this probably on the bottom of its stroke, but it is what it is. Just like so. And that's probably good enough right there for me to access those. So I'm going to go ahead and go grab the torque wrench and bring you guys back and get this first cap torqued on, and we'll discuss that. So, with everything on the rod cap ready, since I am using ARP fasteners, I'm going to be installing some ARP torque lube. So I'm going to go ahead and put some of that on each of these threads here. Make sure there's a nice, maybe not a healthy coat, but just a nice even coat of assembly lube on there. And then same thing with the nuts on here. And the instructions specify to put it on the face that is on the rod cap here. So I'm going to go ahead, get those on ready to go. Now I'm sure some of you have noticed there's a number 8 on this cap. This engine did originally come out of a 68 F350 that was a junkyard donor motor. So these are some of the markings left from the previous rebuild that somebody has done at some point. That's why the rods and the mains on this engine are 20 under, because when I got it they were at 10 under on both. So I'm going to go ahead and put those down snug by hand, just like so. Now the ARP instructions specify 50 foot-pounds in one torque sequence. So I got my 3/8 torque wrench here ready to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and tighten these guys down. So I have it set right at 50. But what I'm going to do is kind of get them down snug where there's a little bit of a resistance on both. And try and do them in a somewhat even fashion with each other. So I'm going to go ahead and torque down this first bolt. Okay, there's 50 on that one. And 50 on the next. So just to make sure, peace of mind, there's 50. there's 50. So, with that, the first piston in this engine is completely installed and ready to go. So, I'm going to go ahead and roll this guy back over and install the next piston on the front of the crank, and we'll go from there. So I'll bring you guys back once I get the block rolled back over and got that piston set up, ready to go. So as the previous side, the operation's going to be the same for all 8 cylinders. I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of a 1540 pre-lube on the cylinder, just to help seat the rings and give them a little bit of lubrication going in so they don't score up the cylinder walls. I also did not mention I put oil on the rings themselves on the piston. So the piston is also oiled on top of the cylinder being oiled as well. So I'm going to go ahead and also install my assembly lube right now onto the rod bearing that is currently on this piston. I'm going to go ahead and just try and get that in shot if I can. If not, you guys understand how to put lube onto a rod bearing by this point. So, I'm going to go ahead and find my orientation arrow, which is that way. So I'm going to go ahead and slide my hose in and let the skirt of the piston index itself into the bore. I'm going to zoom you guys out just ever so slightly. Lift you up just a little bit. So, same thing as before. I'm going to take my rubber mallet, give it some gentle taps. Okay, so that piston is in the cylinder, so I'm going to go ahead and cross over here behind the camera. And what I'm going to do is down in the bore, I'm going to keep an eye on the fuel hose to make sure it doesn't get bound up. But I'm going to go ahead and continue tapping this guy in and getting that installed and ready to go. So just like that, it's indexed on the bottom of its bore. I'm going to go ahead and roll you guys over live while I'm here. Unpin. I'm going to go ahead and rotate over. Just like so. I'm going to go ahead and relock. So now what I can do is bring you guys down so you can see what's going on here. Zoom y'all in a little bit. So you can see that indexed in perfectly, and since that piston is at the bottom of its stroke, puts me in an optimal position. So I'm going to go ahead and remove my fuel hose. It served its purpose there perfectly. Now what I have is obviously my 2 ARP rod nuts, my torque wrench here, some ARP lube for the rod bolts, my rod cap, and the rod bearing. I'm going to go ahead and grab my assembly lube here. I'm going to put a little dash on the crank this time, just let that kind of soak in. But I'm also going to install this onto rod bearing. A little bit of lubrication doesn't hurt, and actually probably over lubrication won't hurt either. So go ahead and get that all lubricated. Rub that all in. Now same thing, you guys can probably see there's a little Sharpie mark on there to index where I took it off, just as a peace of mind reference for myself to put this all back together. And now what I'm going to go ahead and do is take the base of this handle, this rubber mallet, go ahead and get that guy tapped in. So that's seated down all the way. Same thing. Take my IRP lube, excuse me. I'm going to go ahead, get some onto that stud, move my nuts out of the way,
get some onto this bottom stud, kind of spread it around on there, and then repeat the putting it on the face of the nut. I'm going to go ahead and thread that onto that stud there, or that bolt there. And I'm just going to let it go until it's finger tight, which is right about there, so that's good enough for the moment. And then I'm going to put more lube onto this nut, just like so. Same thing, go ahead and just thread that guy on there. And I'm doing this all barehanded because a little bit of grease doesn't bother me, but I do keep a towel around just to kind of wipe the worst off of me, because I kind of like having a personal touch with this when I'm assembling engines. I don't like wearing gloves doing this. That's all a preference thing. So that's down finger tight. Go ahead and clear all my stuff off the engine here. I'm going to grab my torque wrench, which is still set at, there we are, 50 foot-pounds. I'm going to go ahead and get these both down snug. Okay, that one's snug. That one's snugger. Put that down. I'm going to go ahead and torque this side first. Try not to block you guys as much as possible. A little bit easier to hold the head though. Okay, that's tight. Bring this side over. That's tight. So, cylinders 1 and 2 have now had their rod and piston assemblies successfully installed in them. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is roll the engine over, put the crank bolt in, and get you guys set up so you can go ahead and see the rotating assembly running. Alrighty, so with the first 2 pistons installed, I'm going to go ahead and do a rotational check, just make sure everything's spinning over smoothly so far, and then we'll move on. Okay, there comes the piston at the top of its bore, going back down, and there comes the next piston. Oh, I could not be any happier with this. This looks fantastic, guys. I really, really wish you guys could feel this. This feels awesome. It looks awesome. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is quit rotating that for the time being. And I'm going to go off camera and install the last 6 sets of pistons. And then what I'm going to do is bring you guys back so that we can work on installing the timing set here on the front of the engine. So once all 6 other remaining rods are installed, I'll bring you guys back, do another rotational check, make sure everything looks and sounds good, and then we'll move on to the timing set. So I'll see you guys here in a little bit. So the final step for today's video is now with the crank and the rods and pistons installed along with the camshaft. I'm going to go ahead and install my fuel eccentric and my timing chain along with my cam bolt. So as you can see up here, I'm just using the included Comp Cam's timing set that came with my cam kit. So this is a 2108, is the part number on this from Comp. I'm just using the factory fuel eccentric and the washer along with the crank snout woodruff key. And then I'm going to be using a brand new ARP cam bolt. So I'm going to go ahead and get all this stuff unpackaged and kind of get it all set into place on here. And I will bring you guys back once we're all ready. Okay guys, so as you can tell, we kind of skipped ahead in the video there a little bit. And you guys can see that the timing set is currently on the engine already. Well, when I went back to review the footage, make sure everything was how I had liked it, the camera didn't record it. And to be quite frank with y'all, I don't feel like taking the timing set back off to show that again. So I'm just going to kind of do a audible walkthrough. So what I ended up doing was I set the camshaft with the timing dial straight up and down. I installed the woodruff key into the crankshaft and installed it straight up and down. match the timing marks for standard timing on the crank gear and the cam gear dot to dot, installed the timing chain, slid those on as one unit, and then I put the fuel centric on with the camshaft bolt and the washer with ARP lube because I'm using an ARP cam bolt, and tightened everything down to 55 foot-pounds. Because in the ARP instructions included with the bolt, it just kind of gives you a list of generic torques on here. So you guys could see on there for a 7/16 fastener down here, it's 55 foot-pounds. So that's what I ended up torquing it down to. So with that on and torqued in, ready to go, I went through and did a quick spin test, made sure everything rotated smoothly and whatnot, and I am beyond satisfied with the results at this point. So that is going to conclude part 1 or 2 of this series, I believe. I can't remember where I'm at this point. But in the next part, I'm going to go ahead and start working on getting the head studs into the block and dropping head gaskets on and getting the heads installed, and hopefully maybe even the intake manifold if I'm feeling ambitious enough to do that in one video series. So, for any further updates on this, go check out my Instagram at Chewy the Brick. Please like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Helps me out a little bit. Helps me out quite a bit. And go ahead and share it with your friends. You guys have a good one. I'll see you in the next video.